Hello everyone and welcome to my The Bold Fans channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The Bold and the Beautiful BNB's current storylines imply that the program may be preparing to flip the script on Will Spencer's, Crew Morrow, and RJ Forrester's, Brian Nicoletti positions. Could RJ become the dangerous one, putting Will's life at risk? The Forresters handle Will as if he's a wrath machine, flinging punches when provoked. Will could benefit from anger management classes, but he's no worse off than any other hot-tempered guy. RJ and Ridge Forrester, Torsten K., have also started throwing their fists lately. Brooke Logan Forrester, Catherine Kelly Lang, and Electra Forrester, Linnea Grace, have also been administering slaps, indicating that Will isn't the only one violating physical lines. However, RJ has been the victim of Will's attacks, and Ridge and Brooke are upset that their son has been targeted. Eric Forrester, John McCook, was accidentally clobbered, but Will was targeting RJ. The program has leaned into Will and RJ's animosity, particularly because they both desire Electra. Will has been portrayed as an out-of-control villain, while RJ liked to believe he is the good guy, but things could take an unexpected turn sooner or later. BNB has teased the potential of Will getting into a motorcycle accident at some point. It appears that one is in the works for Will, but this does not necessarily imply that he will be held responsible for the catastrophe. What if RJ causes the accident instead? Could RJ become the dangerous one, making Will his victim? Since Will always tends to end up decking RJ when they argue, he might hop on his bike and ride away rather than succumb to that desire. RJ may jump in his car and chase Will nonetheless to finish the confrontation they started. That might lead to RJ driving dangerously in a fit of rage and possibly running Will off the road. If RJ helps to this impending crash in any way, he will face the wrath of Katie, Electra, and everyone else who cares about Will. Katie's accusation of Brooke's son for putting Will's life in danger could exacerbate the Logan sisters' feud. According to the Bold and the Beautiful spoilers, RJ could end up on the hot seat if he leaves Will struggling to survive, so keep an eye out for any scary developments. The evening air over Malibu carried the salt of the Pacific and the low hum of distant traffic as Will Spencer guided his black sports car along the winding coastal road. Only minutes before, the sun had dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky in a fleeting purple dusk that made the water appear infinite. He had left the beach house in a hurry, the dispute with Electra still echoing in his ears. She accused him of being overly emotional, bringing the weight of every family conflict into their relationship. He had attempted to explain that the continual pressure from the Forresters made it impossible to relax, but his comments came out harsher than he had intended. Now all he needed was space, the kind of open road that let him breathe. He didn't notice the headlights approaching too quickly from the opposite direction until they were close. The other vehicle was a sleek silver convertible, the type Ridge Forrester's son loved when he wanted to feel the breeze. RJ Forrester was behind the car, music blasting, windows down, and his head elsewhere. He had spent the afternoon at Bikini Beach, listening to his mother and grandfather analyze Will's most recent outburst. Eric's injured face and Brooke's subdued disappointment had RJ on edge. He accelerated through the curve without monitoring his speed, knowing the route well enough to trust his intuition above the stated limit. Everything happened too fast as the two cars collided at the bend. RJ's convertible deviated slightly from the center line. Will wrenched the wheel to the right as the silver hood filled his windshield. Tires shrieked. Metal collided with metal in a powerful scrape, sending Will's car spinning toward the low stone wall that surrounded the cliffside. The impact was not head-on, but it was sufficient. The sports car slammed sideways, the passenger door crumpling and the glass shattering in a sudden spray. Will's head hit the side window. The world shifted and then went dark. When the first responders arrived, the situation appeared worse than the injuries revealed. Will's automobile had come to a stop against the barrier, one wheel hanging over unoccupied space. RJ's convertible sat a short distance away, its front fender ripped and headlights shattered but still drivable. RJ stood by the roadside, phone in hand, face pale in the flashing lights. He informed the authorities that he had been cut off, that Will had been speeding, and that the curve had approached faster than either of them anticipated. The story wasn't completely false. Will had been driving aggressively rather than cautiously, constantly rehearsing the disagreement in his thoughts. However, the skid traces and angle of collision revealed a more obvious truth. RJ's vehicle had crossed the line first. Will regained consciousness in the ambulance, and the paramedic's voice was steady as she examined his pupils. A concussion, injured ribs, and a severe cut above his left forehead that required stitches. Nothing life-threatening, but plenty to hold him overnight for observation. Katie Logan Spencer arrived at the hospital before the physicians had completed the CT scan. She was at home when the cops called, and her heart dropped as soon as she heard her son's name. By the time she arrived at the emergency hospital, her hands were trembling and her voice was tight with the terror that only a mother understands. Will was already sitting up in the exam bay, with a bandage on his forehead and an ice pack plastered to his side. The sight of him, alive, speaking and able to look her in the eye, caused a surge of relief so intense that she had to hold the bed rail to keep herself steady. Then the questioning started. Will's account was initially fractured, with the concussion obscuring the timeline. He remembered the silver convertible, the sudden brilliance of the headlights, and the forceful yank of the wheel. He remembered RJ's face behind the glass for a half-second before everything went wrong. Katie listened without interfering. When he finished, she just had one question. Did he drive recklessly? Will hesitated. Loyalty to the complex web of family connections clashed with the simple truths. He was on my side of the street. I attempted to avoid him. That's all I know. By morning, both households had received the whole report. Brooke Logan Forrester learned the news from Ridge, who had talked directly with the investigating officer. RJ had been reprimanded for failing to keep his lane and driving too fast. There were no charges filed beyond the citation because both drivers were cognizant and cooperative, and the injuries were not severe. However, the official language was clear enough. Katie viewed the same report on her phone while sitting next to Will's hospital bed. When the words "reckless driving" appeared in the preliminary notes, she felt a chill run through her chest. She did not await an invitation. That afternoon, she drove to the Forrester mansion, where she had been welcomed like family and then treated as an outsider. Brooke greeted her at the door, already braced for conflict. The two sisters had known each other for years, through weddings, betrayals, and the never-ending battle for men's attention. This time the stakes seemed more personal. Katie's son was in a hospital bed. Brooke's kid had put him there. They spoke in the living room, with the ocean visible through the large windows, which had framed so many of their previous clashes. Katie kept her voice calm, but the edge was there. Your son was speeding. He crossed the center line. Will almost went over the cliff because RJ couldn't keep his car where it belonged. Brooke's response was swift, defensive, and familiar. RJ claims Will was the one driving too fast. The police are still reviewing everything. You don't get to decide the story until the facts are resolved. The facts are settled enough, Katie replied. My son had a concussion and injured ribs. Your son left with a ticket. That tells me all I need to know about who was to blame. The fight escalated as it often did. Old wounds opened, names of past lovers and blunders surfaced like oil on water. Brooke accused Katie of raising a son who solved every problem with his fists, citing previous fights at the beach bar and the unintentional hit that knocked Eric Forrester to the ground. Katie responded that RJ had a long history of entitlement, presuming the road, the women, and the future belonged to him only because of his surname. Neither woman was altogether mistaken. Neither was willing to yield the point. Ridge entered the room midway through and attempted to mediate, but his presence exacerbated the tension. He'd already spoken with RJ, who insisted that Will was the aggressor on the road, just like he had been in every previous confrontation. Eric emerged later, still moving cautiously following the earlier event, and expressed his own modest disappointment. The familial lines stiffened in real time. The Forresters banded together around RJ. Katie stood alone on the other side, defending her kid, who had already cost her so much serenity. Will was released the following day. Katie drove him home herself, with the hospital discharge papers folded in her purse. He was quiet throughout the ride, staring out the window at the same stretch of road where the accident occurred. When they arrived at the beach home, he walked straight to the couch and lowered himself slowly, each action timed against the aching in his ribs. Katie sat across from him, waiting. "I don't want this to become another war," he ultimately added. "Electra already thinks I am the problem." Katie inspected her son's face, noticing the bruise darkening along his temple and the fatigue in his eyes. "I am not beginning a war. I am holding someone accountable. RJ was reckless. He could have killed you. That is not something I can overlook because Brooke wants to protect her son." Will closed his eyes. "He was reckless. I was distracted. We were both stupid. That doesn't mean we have to burn everything down." The next few days saw a steady avalanche of consequences. The insurance firms started their investigations. Lawyers from both parties exchanged cautious correspondence. The anxiety at Forrester Creations became impossible to ignore. Every meeting contained an undercurrent of the accident. Electra once paid Will a visit, standing at the beach house's doorway as if she were about to depart. She listened to his apology and insisted that the crash was an accident caused by mutual bad judgment before leaving without making any promises. RJ avoided Will totally. He worked long hours at the design studio, pouring himself into work as his father often did when emotions got too complicated. Katie didn't soften. She made telephone calls. She spoke with the investigating officer for the second time. She made ensured that the citation was kept on file and that the complete accident report was available to anyone who required it. When Brooke suggested they meet and talk like sisters, Katie declined. The usual cycle of forgiveness and reconciliation seemed too convenient, too simple a method to ignore the truth of her son's injuries. She'd spent years watching the Forresters rewrite history to protect themselves. This time she declined to participate. Bill Spencer unexpectedly showed up at the beach house one evening, approximately a week after the tragedy. He'd been traveling and had only recently returned to the news. He listened to Will's account, then Katie's, before sitting in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the gravitas he reserved for situations involving his family. "I know how this works," he explained. "The Forresters will close ranks. Brooke will defend RJ in the same manner she has always protected her loved ones. Ridge will smooth things over. Eric will show disappointment but do nothing. And if we press too much, they will turn Will into a villain again." "That is the pattern," Katie said, meeting his gaze. "So what are your suggestions? Do we pretend it never happened?" "I advise we make sure the truth is on the record," Bill replied. "No more, no less. Will is alive. That is all that matters right now. Everything else is noise." Will listened from the doorway, the bandage on his forehead starting to appear less dramatic. In that moment, he grasped both of his parents' perspectives, Katie's strong desire to defend him and Bill's colder judgment of the long game. He also realized something neither of them had expressed aloud. The catastrophe had altered the warmth of every relationship in their lives. Electra was further distant. RJ was an avowed enemy. The tenuous peace that had existed between the two families during the previous round of fighting had been entirely shattered. In the days that followed, the plot settled into the quieter rhythm that soap operas eventually achieve after the initial explosion. Will recover. The stitches came out. The concussion symptoms subsided. He returned to work, attempting to rebuild what remained of his life with Electra. RJ insisted the crash was joint fault, yet the ticket remained on his record. Brooke and Katie had no more words for weeks. This time, the space between them felt permanent, or at least longer than in prior ruptures. However, the road still existed. The same bend awaited drivers who drove too quickly or irresponsibly. And somewhere in the backdrop of every conversation, family gathering, and quiet evening at the beach house, the knowledge of what had almost transpired persisted. Katie conveyed it the most clearly. She had glimpsed her son's face in the hospital bed. She had read reckless driving in the official report. She had intentionally chosen not to look away. It was unclear whether that decision would cost her more than it protected. In the world that the Forresters and Spencers lived in, practically every option required payment. Katie had decided that the cost of being silent outweighed the cost of standing her ground. For the time being, that was enough. The long-simmering rivalry between the Forresters and the Spencers had spilled over into something far more lethal than boardroom conflicts or stolen designs in the glamorous but treacherous world of Los Angeles fashion and media empires. This time, the conflict overflowed into the windy coastal roads that hugged the Pacific, where one rash moment threatened to permanently alter family allegiance. Will Spencer was driving home from a late night at the beach house, with the ocean air still clinging to his clothes and salt on his lips. Electra had left earlier following another tense conversation regarding her ongoing conflict with RJ. Will's mind raced with frustration. Every contact with his cousin appeared to end the same way. RJ badgering him about Electra, doubting his place at Forrester, or simply existing as the favored son who never had to struggle for respect like Will had. The punch at Bikini Bar lingered in the air between them, that one moment when Will's fist landed on RJ's ribs and triggered a chain of firings, accusations, and family declarations of war. The road curves abruptly toward the cliffs. Will's headlights shone through the darkness. He did not notice the other automobile until it was too late. A sleek black automobile moving too fast veered wide on the corner and clipped Will's car's rear bumper with a terrible crunch. Will's vehicle spun sideways as a result of the incident. Tires shrieked. Glass broke. The world shifted as the automobile slid toward the railing. Will's head hit the side window forcefully. Pain erupted behind his eyes. Then everything became black. When paramedics arrived, the situation revealed an obvious case of excessive speed and poor judgment. The other vehicle's skid marks extended long and irregular across the asphalt. Ridge Forrester Jr., the driver of that car, stood on the roadside, blood on his knuckles from punching the steering wheel in panic. RJ's face turned pale under the blazing lights. He continued saying that it was an accident and that he didn't mean for anyone to get wounded. However, when asked how fast he was going, the cops noticed the alcohol on his breath and the way his hands shook. Will was brought to the hospital with a concussion, shattered ribs, and a nasty gash on his forehead that would leave a scar. Katie Logan arrived within an hour, her heart pounding as she rushed through the ER doors. The sight of her kid lying pallid and bandaged on the trolley almost brought her to her knees. She'd already lost too much in her life, including her own heart and nearly her life while giving birth to this kid. The thought of losing him now, not to an illness or an old enemy, but due to Brooke's son's irresponsibility, felt like a betrayal of everything the Logan sisters were meant to represent. Brooke came shortly after, her face tense with worry. She'd received the call from Ridge. RJ was held for interrogation. The police were discussing dangerous driving and possibly DUI. Brooke's initial reaction was to defend her child, just as Katie's was to protect her own. The two sisters confronted each other in the sterile hallway outside Will's room, their air dense with years of shared history and opposing loyalties. "It was an accident," Brooke explained first, her voice low and desperate. "RJ would never knowingly injure someone. You know that," Katie said, her eyes chilly. "Your son was speeding. He was drinking. He struck my child and may have killed him. Don't stand there and tell me this was an innocent mistake." The argument heated up quickly. Nurses cast glances in their direction. Ridge attempted to interfere, resting his hand on Brooke's arm, but Katie refused to be quiet. She had been watching RJ annoy Will for months. She'd heard Will's frustrated descriptions of how RJ smirked when Will was fired, how he pursued Electra despite her apparent feelings, and how he appeared to enjoy making Will feel like an outsider. Now this. Her reckless driving resulted in her son being hospitalized with shattered bones. Will awoke slowly the next morning, the fluorescent lights glaring against his throbbing skull. Katie sat next to him, her hand wrapped around his. She gradually filled him in, withholding the most unpleasant facts until he was ready. When Will discovered that RJ had been the other driver, something dark settled in his chest. Not surprising. More like validation of all he had already believed about his cousin. Electra arrived later that day, her eyes red from sobbing. She hovered at the foot of the bed, torn between two young men who had each claimed a piece of her heart. RJ called her from the police station, his voice quivering as he said he never intended for this to happen. Will kept a close eye on her, looking for any indication that her devotion was shifting. When she reached for his hand and gripped it securely, something in him relaxed, albeit slightly.